Franco Terrazzano, thanks for joining me today.
Dude, the pleasure's all mine. Happy to be here.
We're in an extraordinary time in Canada. Well, I mean, we all know for the longest time Canadians have been taxed like way, way too much, and even to the point that there are so many taxes that Canadians don't even know that they pay every single day. And it's advocacy groups like yours that really let people know. But the question really comes down to how much is too much, and at what point does that implode? We've heard of the Laffer curve. Maybe we can start there. Maybe we can start at that point. When is too much too much?
Yeah. Okay. So the Laffer curve, I'm glad you brought that up. Look, I'm not a believer in like, oh, we have to be at the optimal point in the Laffer curve, right? I don't buy that for one bit. So essentially what the Laffer curve is, I mean, it's a very useful theoretical tool. It's like, well, if you tax people too much, you're actually bringing in less revenue because like people are just moving to other countries or people are looking for different ways to escape the crushing tax burden. Right. So that's essentially the Laffer curve. Taxes get too high. You reduce the amount of money the government is taking from people. But like, I don't buy this, like, oh, we need the optimal tax level for government revenue. No. Like, look, we are so overtaxed here in Canada. Like, we are so overtaxed. Okay. Let me just give you an example. This is just the average family. Okay. The average family pays about 43% of its budget in taxes. That's nuts, right? Take your paycheck, essentially rip it in half, because that's the tax man, right? Like we got federal and provincial income taxes, federal and provincial sales taxes. You got property taxes. You got federal and provincial business taxes. You've got capital gains taxes on top of that. You've got these import taxes, right? You have carbon taxes, 1 carbon tax, 2 carbon tax, 3 carbon tax, essentially 4 carbon taxes, right? So we're paying so much tax here in Canada. And the reason we're paying so much tax, folks, at the end of the day is because government has become so bloated. They're spending so much money. And you have to remember, even on top of the taxes, at the federal level, you're looking at $1.2, $1.3 trillion of debt. So the taxes are out of control, but you also got to look at the crazy amount of spending, because every dollar the government spends is a tax on Canadians, whether that's through taxes today, taxes plus interest tomorrow, or being funded by the money printer.
So the Fraser Institute, they put together a thing called the Tax Freedom Day, and it calculates basically how long in the year you're working, not for yourself, but just for the government as a whole. And the date gets later and later. I mean, I thought it was in June for a while there. I think it's well into August now. Like that whole time from January 1st to somewhere in August, you're working for the government. You don't get to keep a single penny. It's after that every penny that you make, which they don't even issue pennies because they've devalued the currency so bad that it costs 4 cents to make a penny. This is where we're at. It's just it's gone too far. But there are so many taxes that we don't even know about. So I think it's guys like yourself and myself and a lot of people on social media right now that are starting to point this stuff out. Let's start here. Recently in Canada, there's this boycott on American products. And one of the big ones is alcohol from the United States of America. Now, when you look at the price of alcohol in Canada, most people have just gotten used to that because they don't travel out so very often. Now, I did an experiment, right? And I said, okay, well, let's buy Canadian, right? Let's buy Canadian. And I'm from Windsor, Ontario, and there's Hiram Walkers, and they're a local to Windsor, Ontario. I don't live there anymore, but that's where I grew up, and you could smell the yeast once a month as they were making this stuff. And they would make Canadian Club whiskey. And it's great whiskey. If you like rye, I think you'd enjoy their whiskey. But if you buy it in Canada, it's pretty expensive.
Yeah,
it's pretty expensive. And it's average, let's say around $30 a bottle for a 750 milliliter bottle. Now, I go on trips to Japan often, so I went to check it out. And at the grocery store, because you could just buy liquor anywhere in Japan because they don't have the stupid rules that we have in Canada, or a communist style distributor like Ontario has with the liquor store. And the same bottle, after import taxes, after traveling across the globe, and after exchanging the money, it was in and around $13 for the same damn bottle of whiskey. And it gets even worse. If you go to the United States, I went to price it out. at Walmart in Texas, you can't get the same bottle because they don't make one that small. It's over 1.5 liters for $20. Now, where people don't realize is this, all of that is going into taxes. There are syntax after syntax after syntax that aren't even on the label. It's all behind the purchase price. When you finally, you see the purchase price, and then you're paying taxes on top of it. You pay GST and PST on top of the taxes, on top of the tax price. How do we make this more apparent to Canadians that this is the stuff that you're paying?
Well, essentially what we're doing right now. That's the way you do it, right? Now, look, you mentioned the liquor stuff. I'll get into that in a second, but it's the same at the gas station,
Absolutely.
Right? Where you're paying like provincial and federal fuel taxes. You're paying provincial and federal sales taxes. Those sales taxes, by the way, are tax on tax, right? Because they're calculated after the per liter taxes are already built into the price. So they tax your fuel, they tax those taxes, right? But then also, like, some cities, you're paying transit taxes at the fuel pump, right? So like you're paying like 5, sometimes even 6 different types of taxes if you look at all the different carbon taxes in there. But let's get back to the beer, wine, and Canadian whiskey for a second, because like this is a prime example of just how outrageous taxes are in Canada and how they increase the price. So look, man, you want to have a cold one with one of your buddies, half the price you pay for that bottle of beer is tax. Okay. You want to enjoy a nice Pinot Noir with your better half the price you pay is tax. Or like, I don't know, you want to have some Canadian whiskey at the end of a long work day, 2/3 of the price is tax. It's nuts, right? And like, not only that, but the last time I checked, I believe it's like, if you're looking at a case of beer in Canada versus the US, the amount of tax you pay on that case of beer in Canada is like 5 times more than the amount of tax you pay on that same case of beer in the US. In fact, it's outrageous. And there's a couple different provinces. I think there's 3 provinces where you pay more in tax for a case of beer than the total retail price for that case in like half of the US states. Okay, so we are getting taxed into oblivion here. And, speaking of tax, the federal government back in 2017 under Trudeau, they brought in this sneaky alcohol escalator tax that automatically increases federal excise taxes on beer, wine, and spirits every single year without even a vote in Parliament. Okay, so not only are they absolutely soaking you, they're doing it in such an undemocratic way, right? Like, look, if you're a politician and you think that Canadians aren't paying enough tax, at least have the spine to vote on the tax increase. But that's not what they're doing. And guess what? April 1, folks, Tuesday, you're getting another federal alcohol tax increase.
It's all going up again. It's all going up again. At what point is that? Because that's exponential, right? It's automatic. It happens every year, and it's by a particular percentage, right? And that's a percentage on top of the percent that's already been added. Exactly. So, at what point does it not just turn into a hockey stick graph, and nobody can afford anything?
Well, I don't know about you, but I don't think people can afford anything right now.
We're already there.
You know what I mean? Like, I don't know. Like, I mean, like the gas station. I mean, gas prices have been out of control for how many years now, right? And every single year, the federal government, even though people are like struggling to afford to get to work, the federal government keeps cranking up the carbon tax. No relief at the gas station or on heating bills, right? Carbon tax is costing you like $400 a year alone for the average family to heat their home. Or groceries, like grocery prices are out of control. And like, look, we're talking about taxes, and taxes, I mean, there is no doubt about it. Taxes are making life more expensive, right? If you just look at things like alcohol taxes that directly increase prices, or you look at carbon taxes or fuel taxes that directly increase prices, right? But think about it this way. The best way, the fastest way, the simplest way, the most efficient way for the government to make all aspects of life more affordable is just to stop taking so much money in the first place, right? Because if the government just doesn't take that money in the first place, people have more money to afford more things. Like, it's that simple, folks. And Clyde, let me just talk about the sneakiest tax of them all. I know you know what I'm going to say. The inflation tax.
Oh, of course.
Okay?
Of course.
The inflation tax. So, folks, inflation isn't just this like natural phenomenon. That's not how it works. Inflation is a government policy, and it happens when central banks print up new money out of thin air by buying financial assets, in large part, Government of Canada debt. Okay. So the printing press literally creates money out of thin air, dollars out of thin air with a stroke of a keypad, right? And here's where inflation happens. You can't build farmland out of thin air. You can't print up more gasoline. You can't print up more apples. So essentially, you don't have more products being made, but you have all these dollars that are being made, being printed out of thin air. And what happened during the pandemic is very different than what normally happens with government finances, where you had the central bank at the heart of the pandemic printing up anywhere between like $300 and $400 billion of new money and then dumping it into an economy with revolving lockdowns where production wasn't increasing like it normally would because people were locked down. Okay, that was the perfect storm for inflation, which is too many dollars chasing too few goods. That is the inflation tax. Now, let me just go over some of these talking points from the other side, right? They're saying, oh, it's the pandemic. It's a global phenomenon. It's a war. It's this, it's that, or it's another thing. That doesn't explain general increases in prices. Because if you have a shortage, for example, that thing will increase in price. But if you don't have these new dollars pumped into the economy, then something else would see a reduction in prices, right? The only way that you can sustain general inflation is through the printing press.
Yeah, absolutely. And this has been going on longer than just a pandemic because, you know, we have Mark Carney who's coming in. He's the Prime Minister of Canada right now, the unelected guy who got in with, I don't know, 200, what was that, 100 and something thousand votes. That's incredible. So he's the prime minister, but he used to be the Bank of Canada governor, and then he was the Bank of England governor. And he has, I'd be calling him a one-trick pony because he has one trick, and that's that the money printer go burr, right? This is what he's done in both countries, and I don't see it going any other way if he maintains his position as Prime Minister of Canada after this election that's occurring right now. Now, what happened under Stephen Harper was the time when, the 2008 crash came. And that was another global phenomenon that a lot of people said that Harper saved us from. Now, Harper used something that comes from the Keynesian economic theory of, stimulating the economy with a bunch of spending. That helps put a bunch of liquidity into the marketplace, and then that'll boost the economy and help stave it out. Now, I tend to disagree with that concept. I think if people are going to fail in a marketplace, that they should fail, and then you'll have a quick, probably painful recession, but then soon after you'll have a bunch of real economic growth. Now, what ended up happening was at the same time, Mark Carney was the governor of the Bank of Canada. He pumped that liquidity into the marketplace, as you're talking about. He just turned that printing press on and put interest rates super low, but then kept it there even after Harper was gone. And we've been in this situation. Now, in that sort of environment, what does that tell me? That tells me a lot of people are going to have to get into assets instead of getting into savings. They're going to take their savings and say, well, the bank...
Go to the roulette wheel.
Yeah, the bank's not going to give me any money for my savings, so I'm going to lose it all in inflation. So they put it somewhere. Either they go to the stock market, like you said, the roulette wheel, or they put it into hard assets. And what was the one big asset that everything went into?
Housing. That's
right. And here we are, where it just bids the prices up. Now 100%. We're at a point in time in Canada where I mean, just look at the situation. So I live in a small town in British Columbia. I'm not even in the big city. And in the past decade, houses went from, a townhouse going for $200,000 is now worth over $1 million. That's where we're at. How is that even sustainable? How can people live like that?
You can't. You can't. I mean, I moved out of this place, but I was living in a condo, 415 square feet, maybe. It was a shoebox. $1,500 a month.
That's insane.
For a shoebox, right? No, like people can't afford any of this. And, I see all of the talking heads on media twisting themselves into a pretzel that the only thing on Canadians' mind is this tariff war. Okay. Now, look, I think the tariff war and the knee-jerk retaliatory tariffs are gonna cause people a lot of pain.
Yeah.
I don't want to downplay the economic impact of what's happening between Canada and the US. I'm not trying to downplay that. However, people still can't afford their rent. People still can't afford going to the grocery store, right? People like have no money. We can't afford stuff. So like cost of living is still such a key issue, if not the key issue economically for so many Canadians, right? But people are just like pretending like this doesn't exist anymore, right? People are saying, oh, inflation is coming down, even though everyone knows that prices are still going up. And folks, let me just lay bare this little accounting trick that the media uses all the time to say inflation is coming down. Inflation, as reported by Stats Canada, is just a percentage increase in prices over last year. Okay, so we had prices go up by a 40-year high. Was that 2022? Okay, and so yes, you might see the inflation percentage coming down, but that just means that prices are rising slower than what they were during a 40-year high. But prices are still going up. Okay, so in layman's terms, we had 40-year high inflation, 40-year high price increases in 2022, and every year after, prices are still going up. People who aren't in this like political, media, academic elite class still can't afford life, right? Like it's still such a huge issue for us.
And here's the other accounting trick that they've been doing for a long time. And most people don't realize this, how you measure inflation. So inflation is actually the increase in the monetary supply. The effects of inflation is rising prices.
The real definition of inflation used to be the change in money supply, not the change in prices.
Right. So we're just measuring how the change is affecting prices. And we do that through what's called the consumer price index. That's the basket of goods they talk about, the basket of goods. Now, most people would be surprised to hear that, you know, when the US measures their inflation, Canada measures their inflation, the UK measures their inflation, they don't all have the same basket of goods. So they're not even like, it's not like we're all on the metric system for CPI. We all have our own basket of goods. And not only that, they like to change what's in the basket of goods a lot, and usually to make the numbers look better. It's like measuring something and then changing the unit of measure every time to make it look like you got a good score, right?
Okay, let me also jump in here, right? Because you also then hear pundits or academics or whatever you want to call them saying, well, you know, yeah, sure, Canada's inflation was pretty high, but we weren't as bad as some other countries. Okay, so number one, that's like bragging to your mom about being the most sober person in the drunk tank. Okay, yeah, right.
I like that.
Like, you know what I mean? Like, okay. But number two, hey, guess what? When other countries ran massive deficits, when other countries had their printing press on overdrive, when you have silly policies, you get the same silly results. Okay, like other countries were also on the printing press. Other countries were also running massive deficits. That doesn't mean it's a good thing, right? Like that really hurt citizens, not just in Canada, but also in other countries like the United States or in Europe or whatever. Like these are bad policies that, you know, stem from this like ideological thought that you need bigger government, that you need bigger state, that you need more control over people's lives. But that's bogus. Like the printing press massive deficits are helpful for politicians and the elite class that benefits from those policies. But for like ordinary workers, ordinary people, ordinary Canadians, that hurts, right? Like we are the ones who are picking up the tab, because remember what inflation also is. And when I say inflation, I mean real inflation. The printing press, the increase in the number of fiat dollars. Okay. What inflation also is fundamentally a redistributive scheme, because this money doesn't fall from the sky, right? It's not like you have a helicopter flying around Canada, dropping money to everyone at the same time. What happens is that the new money enters the financial system at certain points, and people who are closer to those new dollars that are being created, they are essentially getting a redistributive effect because they get to spend those new dollars before prices go up. Then the ordinary Canadians who are further away from the printing press end up just with the higher prices. So not only is inflation a tax, not only is inflation a redistributive scheme, but also inflation is probably the most undemocratic tax of them all. And you'll remember some thinkers. One of my favorite economists, Ludwig von Mises, the Austrian economist, he would also say that inflation is the favorite policy of undemocratic politicians, essentially, who know that their policies would never have buy-in from the public if they raise taxes. So they raise the funds through a very sneaky process of printing money, because it's very hard. Like, here, let me give you an example. If in Ottawa, politicians increased income taxes or increased sales taxes, everyone would know about it.
Yeah,
but it's very hard. But only like a couple people know when the Bank of Canada is printing new money, right? It's not transparent. It's not democratic, and is a very sneaky form of taxation.
Oh, and they don't even tell you. I mean, Tiff Macklem was saying, well, we're not just printing money. Well, yeah, you're issuing new lines of credit with a computer, and you're just putting more zeros on an account. Like that. I get it. You're not literally printing money. It's a figure of speech because we live in a digital age, but you're literally making and issuing new line of credit, new money.
Here's a question for you, Macklem. How did the Bank of Canada get all these new dollars in their assets? Like, were you guys selling a bake sale? Did you have a bake sale that nobody knew about? No.
Yeah.
You were printing money. That's what happens.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, they call it a soft default in some circles. So you can look at it this way: the government has to pay back debts, and so therefore it's issuing money to the people that they're indebted to, which is largely ourselves. But when they're paying these debts, they're paying it with new money that they've just printed out of thin air. So it really, at the end of the day, is a form of default. You're just It's like going to your boss, or going to your mortgage bank and saying, here's some monopoly money. I couldn't afford the Canadian money this week. They wouldn't buy it. Why is this possible that they can go ahead and do that?
Well, because they have the power of the state, right? They have the power of taxation, the tool of printing money. And, I'm glad you brought up the debt, because I just think it'd be very informative for people to understand where we are. Okay. So before 2015, before Trudeau came to power, what was it? October 2015. Before his first year in power, the debt stood at about $616 billion. Now, I don't know why I even said the word "about" if I'm going to give you the exact figure, but
well, do you have it to the cent?
About $600 billion. Okay. So think about it this way. It took more than a century and like so many different prime ministers to rack up $600 billion of debt. The debt today stands, let's just call it $1.2 trillion. It's more, but about $1.2 trillion. So in less than a decade, the Trudeau government doubled the debt. Okay. Now, what does that mean? Now, the obvious point is that hurts future generations, right? A baby born today, she is crying because she's already on the hook for about $30,000 in federal government debt, right? Don't even think about student loans. Don't even think about provincial debt. She's on the hook for about $30,000 of debt. Okay, so obviously that impacts future generations, where we're putting this massive tax burden that they never voted on onto their shoulders. Okay, but it also impacts people today. Everyone knows that when you have more debt, you're more likely to see tax hikes, right? And let's talk about the capital gains tax hike that the government proposed in its last budget. Well, that was a clear example of these politicians trying to take as much money from Canadians as they could get away with. Okay, clearest example. They're just flipping over the couch cushions, looking for as much money as they can find. But there's another thing that's going on. Okay. Interest charges on the debt are now blowing a $1 billion hole in the budget every single week. What does that mean? $1 billion is the cost of building a new hospital, give or take. So we're losing out on a new hospital essentially every week because of the interest charges on the debt. Or let me give you two other examples here. Okay. Welcome to Canada, where every dollar you pay in federal sales tax is now going to pay interest on the debt. Every dollar. Or this one, okay? The federal government is wasting more money on interest charges on the debt than it's sending to the provinces in health transfers. Okay, so if we didn't have the debt, a little thought experiment, we could essentially either get rid of the federal sales tax or double the healthcare transfers.
Holy cow. So here's the thing, to keep going with the drinking analogies, because I think that's been really successful so far. People don't want a hangover. They don't want the hangover. So what are they doing? They're going for the hair of the dog. They're like, no, let's just keep drinking. Let's wake up that next morning. I know my head's pounding.
Keep the party going, man.
Let's just get that bottle of whiskey in me and get right back on the high and keep doing that. At what point do we just allow the hangover to happen and actually rein in some of this spending? And how, like, because the longer you put it off, the worse it's going to get. That hangover just keeps building. And when you finally do let it happen, it's just going to hurt. Like, are we headed towards recession, or is this like something that we can stave off just by, I don't know, maybe doing like Doge in the US where they've just cut waste, fraud, and abuse? Is there a way out of that?
Yeah, so those are very good questions. And the only honest answer, and Clyde, I know you like Austrian economics quite a bit, or at least last time we chatted, we talked about Austrian school economics. And one of the things that the Austrians are very clear about is, look, they understand that this unsustainable growth, and unsustainable is essentially fake growth, right? Where you have the artificial money supply or printing press that is essentially artificially low interest rates plus the additional fiat dollars into the system essentially creates this fake growth. And eventually the bubble pops, and that's where you lead into the recession. And I'm kind of glancing over some of the facts, but that's essentially the business cycle, right? Where you have fake growth, and then the bubble pops because it was all, built on a house of cards. And then you have
a housing market of cards,
right? Yeah. And that's essentially the business cycle. The business cycle isn't created by greedy business or whatever, right? Like, or capitalism. No. Through legitimate capitalism, you can have steady growth. That is what happens. And through legitimate capitalism, you actually see prices go down, right? That's how people actually save money in a functioning economy, is that prices go down, your real income increases, right? But it's when you bring in the money printing, the artificially low interest rates, that you have the unsustainable boom that leads to the crash. Okay, so that is what happens. But the reason I bring up the Austrians is they quite rightly point out is that you don't know the timing. There is no legitimate way to figure out what happens. Now, what I will say is, look, eventually these decisions are going to be forced on us, right? Whether we take them today or we don't take the hard decisions today, which we need to do is cut spending, government spending, eventually those decisions are forced on you. And we actually have the case study here in Canada to prove it, right? Look at the early 90s and what happened, where politicians of all political stripes, whether it was the PCs in Alberta, the NDP in Saskatchewan, the PCs in Ontario, or the Liberals federally, they were all forced to cut spending because interest charges would have been just so high because that was the only way people were going to lend money to the governments. And you even had the NDP in Saskatchewan were forced to close dozens of these smaller hospitals across the Prairie Province. So these decisions, if we don't have the foresight from our political leaders to make these tough decisions, tougher decisions are going to be forced onto the people of Canada because this is unsustainable. The question is, when does that happen? Now, the reason I'm looking down at my phone, I don't know if you guys can see this, is because I wanted to get the name of this book, a great book I read quite some time ago, but it's by James Grant. Okay. And it's called The Forgotten Depression. The 1921, The Crash That Cured Itself. Clyde, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. And essentially, it looks at this crash that happened in 2021, and it cured itself. And that's how the economy is supposed to work, because prices come down. Anyways, the book is fantastic, and it shows that until about the Great Depression, which was extended in large part because of bad policies, more government control in the economy, is that in the 2021 crash that nobody's heard of, is essentially the government took a hands-off approach and it allowed the economy to recover faster. Now, the reason I bring that up is because if there is this downturn, the political hard part of this is that people are going to feel pain, right? People are going to feel real pain from it. So that is the hard thing for politicians, is to be honest with people and to be like, look, we have such a mess here in Canada, like more than $1 trillion in debt, interest charges, essentially blowing a new hospital in the budget every week. We have to actually roll up our sleeves and cut back the massive costly government. But the problem for them is that, look, you could have some tough times. The good news is like after a hangover, right, you go through a couple bad days of pain, but then you get back on the right track. And that's essentially what's needed.
That's the thing. So speaking of like depression, so depression era, I think the Austrians rightly point out that the depression wouldn't have been the Great Depression. It would have been another sharp recession and back on if it wasn't for federal government initiatives at the time. They were to keep the price of food and farmers' goods up. They were telling people to till over their fields. They were telling them to take their livestock and cull them and bury them. They thought that by having high prices would help the farmers rather than a deflationary cycle.
Yeah.
Now that gets into so deflation. This is the whole concept. So the idea of deflation is we hear this all the time, is we can't have deflation. We need to have inflation at a small amount, because deflation will cause people to hoard and stay away from the economy, and it cuts all economic activity.
Yeah, that's incorrect, because you're not looking at the structure of production in the right way, right? So like essentially goods are made because they go through all these different production cycles or whatnot, right? But essentially, like, the argument is like, oh, well, you won't have this business investment, yada, yada, yada. But what you're forgetting is that if you have a period of deflation, not only are people like prices going down, like people can now afford more things, but more importantly, the cost of doing business also drops. So that doesn't necessarily change any profit margin. You know what I mean? Because yes, like what you're selling might go down, but what you're buying, like inputs into production, also declines. So you're not even changing the profit spread.
But the thing is, so I've tried this experiment. Say, okay, well, I'll steel man their argument and say that if prices go down, will people stop engaging in that market? And throughout the economy, there are all kinds of examples of this. So if you look at electronics are constantly going down.
Oh, totally.
The products are getting better, and every year it's cheaper and easier. You could the fact of the matter is, people are not staying away from the market and waiting for the next best thing. They're buying the thing that comes out today. And some people are buying in the used market, and some people are buying in the brand new market. And that's the thing when it comes to, mountain bikes, for example, because they have a lot of that stuff in this region, in the sea to sky country. People are always buying the newest, hottest thing. The prices are coming down, but the technology is getting better every time. So I don't really think that it pans out, this idea.
No, it doesn't. And you're looking at it from the consumer. All I was saying is from the investment standpoint, right? Mm-hmm. Where, like, your electronics example, the price of a new phone, phones are way better than they used to be, even like 5-10 years ago. And now, like, everyday people can afford a phone, right? Like, everyone has a phone now. People can afford it, even though the technology of a phone would have been insane to people 20 years ago, what you can do on your brand new iPhone. But like, you still see investment into that sector, because just because prices go down, it doesn't mean that profits are, just being destroyed, because also input prices are going down.
Well, that's it. So, I mean, everything across the board went down. So in the turn of the century, the robber baron days, it was nothing but deflation everywhere. In fact, if you look at America at the turn of the century, not the turn of this past century, we always say the turn of the century. Yeah. I always forget that we just went through a turn of a century. But in that era, so they had constitutional money. They had, the gold standard. They had weights and measures for money. I think gold was set. I think was it pegged at like $27 per an ounce.
Oh, I don't remember the exact one.
It was really,
you had real money, right? And what you would notice is that prices go down, and that's how people actually were made better off. It's not always that they were always getting raises or whatever, but it's that even if their wage rate stayed the same, they're actually becoming richer because everything else is declining in price, right? But we've seen the exact opposite here in Canada. Let me just also put this into context, right? You mentioned electronics going down, even though the quality of electronics are so much better. If you look at like what's being produced in the free market or quasi-free market, that is what happens. The tendency towards better products at lower prices. Now, contrast that with what government produces, whether it's education, healthcare, or whatever, or in any sector that is so overly regulated by the government, you can't even call it a free market anymore. Okay. So in the free market or quasi-free market, you have prices going down and quality going up. Everything that the government even sniffs at, you have the exact opposite. right? Because you have a government-controlled monopoly. You have prices going up and quality getting worse, right? So how come in the private sector, you have falling prices, better product, and in government, you have higher prices and also worse product? Also in government, we set these arbitrary standards of like how much money we're spending is a success. Let me take this defense target of 2%. Okay. Look, I bet that a lot of people who are listening in this probably say, you know what, Canada should spend more on defense. Okay. Like I'm not even going at that argument, but just think about how ridiculous it is that only in the government do we measure something as being successful with how costly it is. Yeah. Like, oh, we spent more money, so it was a success. Right? Like we're not looking at outcomes. We're not looking at anything. Like a 2% target is so arbitrary. And guess what? A government could get to 2%, 3%, 20% if it just wasted a ton of money. Like how is that success?
Well, and they're very good at that. They're absolutely good. And we've seen that in real time. We've seen that in real time. I think the one that started waking people up a lot was this Arrive Can app scam. That
Arrive scam. It started at, okay, let me just dive into that. Folks, the app launched initially for $80,000. Okay. And then it ballooned to like $60 million. But even the Auditor General was like, we think it's $60 million. The records are so shoddy that we actually don't know how much the government is spending on this simple app. And why do I say it's a simple app? Because you had two independent tech groups reproduce the app over the span of a long weekend. Okay, so instead of $60 million, we probably just could have got a couple nerds in the room, gave them a crate of Red Bull, and they would have got this app done. Right?
Yeah. Like, well, I mean, and then the thought is, why do we even need this app? Because it's intrusive, and I don't like it. Felt like malware going on everyone's phone. Nobody
and here's
wanted
the brownie
it.
points. Here's the brownie points, folks. The government executives overseeing Arrive scam took $340,000 in bonuses.
That's insane.
Isn't that nice, folks? Okay,
that's the bureaucrats hired by the government.
That's government bureaucrats overseeing the Arrive scam, a national debacle, regardless of where you are in the political system, a national debacle, $340,000 in bonuses. Okay, this is how much Canadian taxpayers are getting ripped off. Folks, there is a party going on and you're not invited, okay? There's the makers versus the takers, the taxpayers versus the tax consumers, okay? The Bank of Canada, right? Clyde's favorite crown corporation. The Bank of Canada.
I have lots of favorites. Call me boat's way up there with me. They're DC ferries.
Oh yeah. Okay. So Bank of Canada, folks, has one job. Keep inflation low and around 2%. In 2022, 40-year high inflation. Okay. The upper ups at the Bank of Canada admitted that they got some stuff wrong. I want to know what they got right. But then they also said that they should be held accountable. Well, guess what they did that year? 40-year high inflation. They handed out $20 million in bonuses. Okay. The Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, they have repeatedly said that they have one overarching objective, housing affordability for all. Well, since 2020, people can't afford homes. Housing crisis, if you will. They've handed out more than $100 million in bonuses since then. Okay. The CBC, the state broadcaster, running around, claiming they're poor, begging for more taxpayer money, millions of dollars in bonuses every single year, where executive bonuses at the state broadcaster cost more than what the average Canadian worker makes an entire year. Yeah, folks, there's a party going on. You're paying for it, but you're not invited.
Holy cow. That's insane. Now, I mean, like talk about perverse incentives, you know, when really what it comes down to in a lot of these bureaucrats is spending the money. If you spend the money, if it's spent, then your bonus, I guess, is based on what kind of cash flow went through your agency. Is that how that works?
No, they have like these performance metrics that they make themselves, and they say, "Oh, I showed up to work twice a week with my shoes tied. Bonus." Right? Like
shut up. I mean, I hate laughing because it makes me angry, but I mean, I don't know how else to react to that.
And let me so let me go to the biggest scam of all. And Clyde, I know we're changing topics, but I got to pump the book. Okay.
No. Oh, of course. I wanted to ask you about that. I just didn't know how we are going to segue to that.
So I'm just going to jump right in there. So the biggest scam of them all, the carbon tax. Okay. The biggest scam of them all. And folks, I just wrote a book, April 10th. Axing the Tax, The Rise and Fall of Canada's Carbon Tax. Shameless plug. Okay, so listen to
Well,
this.
we're going to try to meet. When is it available? First, before you get into
April
it,
10th.
I want to.
April 10th, folks.
April
You can get it
10th.
on Amazon.
Is there early access on
Yeah,
Amazon
right
so
now.
people can?
Right now. Yeah.
I'll make sure before the end of the right after we finish this stream, I'm gonna get a link down in the description.
Oh, amazing.
So people can, because I want you to like actually get lots of sales, because here's the way Amazon works. If you get lots of sales leading up to it, like a lot of pre-sales, then it gets bumped up to the top seller list. And if it gets up to the top seller list, then it gets pumped out on Amazon as a whole for people who buy lots of books. So let's make sure everybody in the chat, we'll make sure that we get that link out to you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. But the reason I say it's a scam, okay, is because it has all the elements of big, bad, bossy government, where you had the elites in, I don't want to paint everyone with a broad brush, but you have the elites in the media, elites in taxpayer-funded academia, the elite politicians, the elite government bureaucrats, these laptop activists, forcing ordinary Canadians to pay more for the necessities of life, like driving to work, heating your home, buying groceries, because the carbon tax makes all of that more expensive. Okay. And then they try to tell you that if you care about the environment, you better pay your carbon tax, right? Even though the vast majority of countries don't impose national carbon taxes, all you have to do is look south of the border to see that Washington, D.C., regardless of who occupies the White House, hasn't brought in a carbon tax. Yet they tried to convince Canadians or sell to Canadians that you must pay the carbon tax. But like, folks, a couple things here. Number one, did you guys know that for the most part, the people who brought in carbon taxes never really got consent from the people? Okay, let's start in British Columbia, Clyde, where you are, where in 2008, they brought in the first economy-wide carbon tax. Well, the election just previous to that, the Liberal government at the time made no mention of the carbon tax. Okay.
No.
And then they brought in this carbon tax, and then they told British Columbians two things. Number one, that it would be revenue neutral. Okay. That there would be enough tax cuts to offset the new carbon tax. Within 5-ish years, they broke that promise. And then they started using these like pre-existing tax credits as a way to claim it was revenue neutral, even though some of the tax credits have been around since the 1990s. Okay. So it wasn't revenue neutral. It never was. This revenue neutral claim has always been the wolf in sheep's clothing. And then what did the British Columbian politicians say? Then they said, don't worry, folks, this will reduce emissions by 33% by 2020. Not only did they promise that, they brought in legislation to mandate that. They brought in a law. Well, guess what? You go to the government of BC's own data, and it shows that emissions have gone up. So emissions haven't gone down a little bit, they've gone up, even though they legislated emissions reductions. Okay, so all along, they were never honest with British Columbians. Then you look at Alberta. Okay, no. The NDP government in Alberta, they never ran on a carbon tax. A couple years after they got elected, they then bring in this carbon tax. You know, thankfully, the next government did away with the provincial carbon tax there with their very first bill. And the same story happened in Ontario with the Wynne government. They ran an election campaign, never ran on a carbon tax, then they brought one in. Okay, and I'm using that to segue to Trudeau and the 2015 election. Clyde, if you look back to 2015, what do you remember from that election? Probably what? Legal weed?
Yeah, right? So it was legal pot. That was the thing, and transparency. We're going to have a more transparent government, and we're also going to be reforming how we vote in our elections.
Right. And if you thought about taxes back in 2015, the one thing you probably would have remembered was a tax cut for middle-class Canadians and those working hard to join the middle class, right? That's probably what you got away from the 2015 election from the Trudeau Liberals. Buried 39 pages into their platform was a very vague mention of some price on carbon and to work with the provinces to reduce emissions. But back in 2015, you had to squint very hard for what became the Trudeau Liberals' signature tax, the carbon tax, right? And like, look, if you were to ask someone in 2015, like, do you care about the environment? Everyone cares about the environment. Everyone wants a better environment. But even the polls showed in the early days of the carbon tax from Trudeau that Canadians couldn't afford even a monthly Netflix subscription and extra taxes. Okay, so Trudeau was never honest with Canadians about the cost of the carbon tax, about what the carbon tax meant, and Trudeau never fully got consent from Canadians, okay? So then fast forward to 2019 election. Well, you'll remember that in 2019, the carbon tax was relatively low. Then it was about 4 cents a liter of gas. And the former environment minister at the time, Catherine McKenna, said they had no intention of continuing to crank up the carbon tax beyond 2022, right? So they misled Canadians again. And then after the election, they announced they're going to keep cranking up the carbon tax, making your life more expensive every single year until 2030 and likely beyond that. So all along the way, even though you had these big politicians, government, media, laptop activists, and even business groups pushing for carbon taxes, they were never open or honest with Canadians about what that meant, ever.
No. But here's the thing. They wrote about it extensively. If you look at Mark Carney's book, he had a book published, and he's been an economic advisor. And I mean, we all know the connections with Klaus Schwab, the World Economic Forum, and Justin Trudeau, and several members of his cabinet. I mean, Chrystia Freeland was sitting on the board of trustees at the World Economic Forum. So this is I mean, think what you want of the World Economic Forum. They're diabolical or they're just a lobby group. But either way, even if they're just at its most benign, just a lobby group, they were very involved with the Trudeau's government cabinet. And they've been advocating for this stuff for a very long time. So if you look just below the surface, you'll know that what they were saying to the public was absolutely BS. They wanted to bring more taxes, more restrictions in the economy, and they've been bragging about doing it for years.
Yes, and the carbon tax is very much about control, right? Because at the end of the day, a carbon tax is this: do what we say or pay. We don't think you're living your life the right way, so we are going to tax you, dear citizen, until you comply, right? Like that is essentially what the carbon tax is. And then they told you that, oh, don't worry, the carbon tax is going to make you richer, right? How many times have they said that? Oh, 8 in 10 Canadians get more in the carbon tax than or get more back in rebates than they pay in the carbon tax, which is like baloney. Like, first of all, from a theoretical construct, everyone knows that you can't give the government $20 and then somehow get $50 back, right? They hit you with the carbon tax. Then they skim hundreds of millions of dollars off the top to pay for the bureaucrats to hammer you with the carbon tax. Then they charge a sales tax on top of the carbon tax. So look, there is no way a government can do that, then somehow make everyone better off. It's phony baloney. It's magic math. But then look at the empirical data, where the government's own nonpartisan independent budget watchdog has written not one, not two, but 3 reports showing that the carbon tax costs average families hundreds of dollars more every single year than what they get back in rebates. Okay.
But it's worse than that. It's much worse than that because of the snowball effect of this carbon tax on all the other products in the market. Yeah. So the 100%. Price of it's an inflationary tax. So it's inflationary, not like we were describing inflation before, but it's inflationary in the new modern definition of it. It leads to rising prices. So because of that, we have anything that goes on a truck and has to be transported to you costs more because of that. And it's not the truck driver who's filling up his tank that is going to foot the brunt of that cost. This is how it works in any business. The cost of business means the prices at the end of the day, the consumer level, go up.
100%, right? Like, folks, if you make it more expensive for a farmer to grow food and you make it more expensive for a trucker to deliver food, you're making it more expensive for everyone who's buying the food at the grocery store. Right? Like it's that obvious. But then, okay, so let me just finish this thought, because theoretically, it's so obvious that there's no way the government can make you better off with the carbon tax, right? And then there's the empirical evidence from the government's own independent budget watchdog. But then there was also the political evidence. When Trudeau stood surrounded by his Atlantic Canada caucus and announced relief by removing the carbon tax from furnace oil. Now, everyone looking knew that the mask was off, because if the carbon tax doesn't make life more expensive, then why are you providing relief by removing the carbon tax from one fuel source, which was nakedly political, but it was also nakedly obvious at that point in time to everyone in Canada that, surprise, the government has been spinning you for all this time. And of course, the carbon tax is making your life more expensive, right? It just became so obvious when that happened.
It's incredible because as time goes by, more and more of these people who have they put this out as their this is they're preaching out this idea that it's the environment. They're saving the environment. We want to help save the environment. There is nothing more important than this cause, saving the environment, or saving the climate. They say it's a existential threat. This is number one. But as soon as it becomes politically expedient, they cut those programs. The same thing happened recently in British Columbia with David Eby, because in British Columbia, they've been putting forward incentives for people to get into electric cars and to use alternative energy forms, right? This is a thing. And so what they do is the government gives out grants to people that buy an electric car, put a battery bank in their home, put solar panels on their roofs, all of these things. And just recently they announced that in British Columbia, those exemptions, they're no longer going to be eligible for anything that was a product from Elon Musk. I'm not kidding. They literally removed it from anything that's Elon Musk. Instead of the environment and the climate being their most important existential threat to the world, they've switched gears, and Elon Musk derangement syndrome has taken precedent over all of it. This just tells you that they're not that serious about it. They're just using it as an excuse to tax you and for more control.
It's all, and it's proof that this was always about politics, not the planet, right? Mm-hmm. But look, like, let's even just take them at their face value, right? That, climate change is the number one thing that we should be worried about. Let's just take them at their face value. Well, guess what? And they should know this, the economists, right? They should know this. Inelastic demand, right? Driving to work, fueling up your car, heating your home, buying food, those are necessities of life. And they promise, oh, don't worry, there will be all these new alternatives. You won't have to drive to work. You'll have an electric unicorn to take you to work. Well, guess what? BC has had the carbon tax since 2008, right? So what is it, 2025? So what, 2 decades later, people still have to drive to work with fueling up their car with gas or their truck.
It's not changed. It's just more expensive.
So here's the thing. You can't carbon tax away somebody's necessity to fuel up their car, heat their home, and put food in the fridge. So by carbon taxing Canadians, you're not reducing emissions. You're just making people have less money in their pockets for every other necessity of life. That's all you're doing. You're not reducing emissions. You're reducing the amount of money people have. But number two, even if carbon taxes reduced emissions in Canada, and I just mentioned BC, emissions have gone up, okay? But even if you could reduce emissions in Canada, that would still not move the needle on global emissions for 2 reasons. Number one, Canada makes up 1.4% of global emissions. So even if the government had its way and shut down every industry in Canada, you wouldn't be reducing emissions, right? Because another thing happens, what's called as carbon leakage, i.e., if you have way too much carbon taxes, too much regulations in one jurisdiction, you don't reduce global emissions, you push these businesses to set up shop in other countries, right? So, right? But number two, guess what? The vast majority of countries have rejected national carbon taxes. We talked about the US, no national carbon tax. Well, guess what? Russia, India, Brazil, also no national carbon tax. So you have 4 of the 5 largest emitters in the world with no national carbon tax. Okay, so even if you take their claims at face value, it still is bogus. It's still 100% bogus.
Yeah, and I actually like Pierre Poilievre's idea that he came up. Now that he's campaigning, he's got all of these platform ideas, and one of them was let's incentivize Canadian companies to come and produce their products here in Canada instead of in China, where there are no environmental standards. If we care about the globe and a global thing, if the environment is the thing, we have better standards. We are cleaner when we do have industry. So let's bring those industries here, and instead of sending them off with perverse or with disincentives. And that's really all that this is. All of this extra taxation, all of this extra burden on businesses and consumers and everybody, taxpayers. It's disincentivizing people from even being here in the country.
And let me just add one more reason why I think this book is important. Have you ever heard "The king is dead, long live the king"? Right? Yeah. We've all heard that quote. Well, look, what you're seeing from the environmental activists or the carbon tax pushers, they're not ending the carbon tax, right? Right. And this is what Carney's running on. He's not scrapping carbon taxes. He's changing it. They're relabeling it, repackaging it, and they're going for a full strategic retreat on the consumer carbon tax to bring in new forms of carbon taxes by another name, right? So what Carney has done, he set the consumer carbon tax rate to 0. But what he wants to do is he now wants to hammer Canadian businesses with these huge hidden carbon taxes. And then he hopes you won't notice when your life gets more expensive. Right. So this book also details the fight ahead against carbon taxes. Whether it's this, hidden carbon tax on business that Carney's running on, but then you also have these international elites, whether it's like groups like the World Economic Forum or, the United Nations or the IMF, or even these media elites internationally are still pushing for carbon taxes on the people. So this book also highlights ways for you not to fall into their trap, because the fight against the carbon tax is not over. And I think this book highlights what you have to be on the lookout for, because also remember, folks, carbon taxes aren't just the carbon tax that you pay at the pumps, right? For example, you've probably heard of the oil and gas cap, right, Clyde? The production cap on oil and gas. Well, how are they going about doing that? Through a cap and trade carbon tax, right? So it's not just about the carbon tax you see. A lot of these different, energy regulation, stranglehold on our economy, a lot of that stuff is actually done through the tool of carbon taxes.
Franco Terrazzano, it's so awesome having you here. I'm going to get into the live Q&A session on this at this point. If you are watching this after the fact, if you're watching this tomorrow when it publishes, you're not going to catch the Q&A. You got to be part of the live audience. Now, if you are a member of the channel, you can go back and watch any of these live streams and catch the Q&A after the fact. But we set it up so if you want to catch it and you want to do it without becoming a member, you have to catch it live. So we're going to get into the live portion of this, but for everybody else that's watching this after the fact, well, we'll see you in the next one, obviously, or become a member and go check it out over there. Franco Terrazzano, thank you so much.
Hey, it was my pleasure, man. Thank you so much. And people, hit that like button.